All right then. And thank you again, everyone. Thank you for being with us. So I wanted to share some ideas, kind of talking about relationships in general, working up to particularly romantic relationships in honor of Valentine's Day, our relationships with our significant others, with our life partners, with our spouses, with those people who are just extremely special in our lives. And what we want to talk about is how we can use relationships to kind of judge where we are on our spiritual path. And then how by practicing the art of love, as Eric Fromm might call it, the art of relationships, by consciously choosing to improve the relationships in our lives, that what we are doing is we are making love our spiritual practice. We are using our relationships as a path to God. And I said use, and it seemed a little harsh when I said it, kind of like it's a tool, like it's a commodity, it's something to be consumed, and I don't mean it in that way at all. Perhaps we can follow it. Perhaps we can surrender to it. Perhaps those are better words. So what we want to think about then is we want to come together, and the first part of the year in January we came together and we really in several different ways looked at the fundamentals of what Dr. Holmes teaches us in the Science of Mind text. There's a power for good in the universe and you can use it. Change your thinking, change your life. It is done unto you according to your belief. As you think and believe in your heart, so it is. And what he's telling us, and this is really important because we have to recognize that what we do as human beings is we hear these things, we read these things, we think about these things, and then we go back to living. We go back to our ordinary lives. And sometimes we forget to take what we have learned with us. We kind of compartmentalize. This is part of how we separate ourselves. We compartmentalize our life. The spiritual part of our life is for Sunday morning for an hour from 11 to 12, and maybe for 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening when we do our spiritual practice. But then we go on. To doing all of the ordinary things that we are used to doing in the same ordinary way that we used to do them. And very often that same ordinary way is coming from an idea of separation. It's coming from an idea of differences. It is not coming from an idea of oneness and of unity. So if we truly believe, if we get the essence of what we're talking about, that we live in a spiritual universe, even that which we call matter, even that which appears to be hard, and solid, is not. We know at the atomic level, we know that things are in there zipping around. They're not solid. It's kind of like the fan blade, If you've ever, unfortunately, tried to move a fan while it was running, a window fan or a floor fan, and got your finger in too far, you understand that even though there's space in between the blades, they're moving so fast that they appear to be solid. And that's what we have with the things that we call matter. And then, of course, when we get down even further into the level that the quantum physicists talk about, it's even stranger. It's even more different, As if the things may be there or they may not be there, but they're there when you're looking at them. And a whole range of things that I truly don't understand, other than it's not what it seems to be. So we live in a spiritual universe. That which we call matter is the unformed energy of the universe taking form. Right? Out of the invisible comes the visible. It exists in time and space and form temporarily. Goes back into the invisible. This is the wheel of life, the cycle of life that we have. This is a spiritual universe. The activity of spirit is thought. It is mental. the act of creation by the Creator is an act of will and volition, a mental act, an act of thought. It is represented to us in the mythology of Genesis as in the beginning. And in the beginning it was void, and there was chaos, and there was darkness. And the Spirit of God moved and said, "Let there be," and there was. We live in a spiritual universe, and the activity of spirit is thought. And something responds to that thought. Something acts upon that thought. We call it the law of mind. Dr. Holmes calls it the law of mind. Traditional Christianity calls it the Holy Spirit, the doer of the word. Something responds to that thought and does whatever needs must be to produce the conditions and the circumstances in our lives that are the perfect outpicturing of that mental equivalent that we have provided for it. We have to stop. We have to stop and ask ourselves. Now, we went through this for 4 weeks at least in January, and then a 5th bonus week. The essence of the teaching. There's a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief. The same idea is taught in Christianity. When Jesus says, "It is done unto you according to your belief," all Dr. Holmes was doing was stating that in a little more modern language. We see it in Old Testament Judaism, in Proverbs, where it says, as a person thinks and believes in his heart, so is he. We see it in Buddhism. We're told that everything we experience is a result of what we thought. We see it in Stoic philosophy. What the mind can conceive and believe, the mind can achieve. We see it in new kind of self-help psychology, psycho-cybernetics, Maxwell Maltz. Change your mental image, change your perception of yourself, and then the situation changes. The same idea keeps popping its head up many different ways. Ralph Waldo Trine said there's a thread that runs through all religions. Let's follow that thread and see where it leads us. So if we truly consider and if we truly believe that the experiences that we go through in life, the people that we meet in life, those who come in to our lives, some come and stay a long time, some come and go quickly, some go and we bless them on their way. We can't wait for them to leave. It doesn't matter what the exact situation is. What we want to consider is that they are there in our lives by right of consciousness. Now, this is very hard sometimes for people to accept, for us to accept. We've grown up for a very, very long time believing in victimhood. We are victims of life. We are here. We didn't choose to be here, but we are here. And everybody is trying to do unto us and all these things, and that first level of human consciousness, you're either a victim or a victor. And the idea is to move from being a victim to be the victor, to be the winner. And of course, you can only be a winner if somebody else is a loser. You can only be a victor if you make somebody else the victim. So it's really not much different consciousness. It's still a belief in victimhood. And it keeps flipping back and forth over the years. This side is up, that side is down. Years later, it's vice versa. But what we want to come to question ourselves about today is, do we truly accept, do we truly believe that the circumstances in our lives, the people who are in our lives, the quality of the relationship that we have with those people is an outpicturing of our deepest beliefs? Not necessarily a belief that you can put your finger on, not necessarily a conscious belief, but the sum total of our consciousness. Right? Dr. Holmes tells us don't go trying to find that one that one thought that you have that's causing the undesirable condition in your life, because you'll never find it. It's an accumulation. It's an outpicturing of race consciousness, perhaps collective consciousness, or collective unconscious, as Carl Jung called it. What is happening in our lives is a result of what we think and we believe in our hearts, in our subconscious. And what that means is that the people and the relationships are a perfect barometer of what we truly believe. Sometimes in class I would ask the students, just go through a week and observe. It's easier for us to observe other people. We're told you can see the splinter in your brother's eye, but you can't see the plank in your own. Go through life and observe, starting with other people, and then turn to your own self and ask, what would a person have to believe to be true in order to behave that way? Look at their behavior and ask yourself, what would that person have to believe to be true in order for them to behave that way? And if you do this for a while, you can do it with other people, and you can say, oh, well, I see that. I see how what they might believe outpictures in the choices that they make, the people they associate with, the jobs they take, things like that. And then turn to yourself. And once we really start to get that, once we really start to understand that life is an outpicturing of our belief, I'll give you an example. It may have happened to you. You may have seen it happen with people that you know. I'll give it to you in two different ways. I'll give it to you, one in job and one in relationships. Have you ever had a job or seen somebody who had a job and they just couldn't stand it? After a while, they just couldn't stand it. They had to leave. Whether it was the working conditions, whether it was the people they had to work with, whether it was the boss, there's something about it they just couldn't stand anymore. So they decide to up and leave. They go and they get a new job. They get hired someplace else. And maybe they move across the country, completely change the scenery. And they get settled in their new position, and within 3 years' time, it's deja vu all over again. Whatever was going wrong in the last job is going wrong in this job as well. See, wherever you go, there you are. They took their consciousness with them. See, people in relationships, they leave one relationship and they move to another relationship. And of course, the problems with the last relationship were all the other person's problems. Right? They were this, they were that, and they were the other thing. But now I found you. Now I found my perfect person. And now I'm ready to start this new relationship. But in 3 years' time, the relationship looks pretty much like the old relationship. They brought their consciousness with them. They didn't change. They didn't grow. They were coming from a place of, the problems are not mine. The problems are somebody else's. All I need to do is get rid of them. They're broken. They don't work. And I will move on with my life and everything will be better. And it doesn't work. This is a teaching story about the man who was driving through the Amish country and he got lost. And of course, this was before GPS. Excuse me. The cold is breaking up a bit. I apologize for that. So he saw two men sitting on a porch of a farmhouse, and he went up to them and he asked for directions to a certain town, and the gentleman on the porch, old Amish gentleman, gave him the directions. And the fellow said, "Can you tell me what kind of people I might find at that town?" And the old Amish gentleman says to him, "What kind of people were in the last town you lived in?" And the man told him, oh, they were good people, they were wonderful people, they were kind, and they were loving. And the Amish gentleman says, yep, you'll find them. You'll find them up the road, right where you're going. And a little while later, another car came and stopped, and another man came and asked for directions. And he said, now what kind of people might I find up in that town? And the Amish gentleman said, well, what kind of people were in the last town you left? And the guy says, they were mean, they were greedy, they were selfish. He says, I didn't like them. And the Amish gentleman says, well, I'm sorry. He says, but you're going to find them up ahead, up the road. They were carrying their consciousness with them. The people that they surrounded themselves with, the experiences that they had, were an outpicturing of their own consciousness. Once we truly understand this, once we truly come to understand this, and once we accept that responsibility, that's the hard part for most of us. It's a lot easier for us to just think that I'm okay, but everybody else really needs a lot of work. Once we start to accept that, then we can look at our relationships as a barometer of where we are on our spiritual path. And we can make improving our consciousness, as demonstrated in the improved relationships, we can make that a spiritual practice. Now, we have relationships with everything, not just people. We have relationships with even inanimate things. And I just want to point out one, and I'm going to use money as an example, because that's a tough one for many people. And Kennedy Schultz, who was the pastor down in Atlanta for many years, he used to teach a prosperity class. And he would ask people to consider the way that they handled their money. How did they treat their money? Now, this was in days when people actually used cash, right? Before plastic or your phone, where you just swipe something and you don't even think about it. And that's important. Keep in mind what's happening there is we're swiping something and we're not even thinking about it. We're not even making our connection with what just happened there. So what Kennedy would do in order to force people to take a look, just to take a look, to examine their beliefs about money, he would ask them to examine how they handled it. Was their money clean or was it dirty? If it was dirty, did they wash it? Could you put it into a little sack, a little cheesecloth sack, and throw it in the washing machine and wash it to make it clean? He asked people to get out the ironing board and the iron and to press their money, and to say affirmations about money as they were pressing it, to make the money that they handled crisp and clean. And instead of carrying it in a wallet or a change purse where it was all folded up, he had them get a billfold, the long, flat billfolds. If any of you traveled, we used to have one that held your passport and your credit cards and all kinds of things, and then it would flip open. You could put your airline tickets in it. Something like that to keep the money flat, to keep it from just shoving it down in our pockets, shoving it down in our purse. And he did that because it forced people to come to a realization of how they handled money. And most of the time they were doing it in an unconscious manner. And they actually had a fear that money was dirty. Didn't want to touch it. It had been in so many different hands. Didn't want to touch it. He told people, go to the bank and get new money. Take your old money to the bank and just go to the teller and say, I'd like some nice, crisp, new money. I'm gonna trade this in. And by forcing people to examine their relationship with money, they could then start to think about the spiritual principles behind money. Money is a symbol of God's prosperity. Money is a symbol of supply. Supply is inexhaustible. Supply is never ending. Supply is the activity of spirit taking the invisible into the visible in whatever form is appropriate at the time. And are we treating our money with that in mind, with that respect in mind? Eric Butterworth in Spiritual Economics tells us, He says, if you look at a dollar bill in the U.S., on the front it's limiting. In the front it tells you the denomination and how much this particular bill is worth. But on the back it says, "In God we trust." And really what money is a symbol of trust. We trust that God supplies us with all of our needs, right? The person we give the money to trusts that they can take that money and they can give it to somebody else and they can exchange it for whatever value they want. So money is a symbol of God's trust. And we don't think about it that way. We treat it, we go through life, we think about it in an unconscious manner. Many times we get paid and our paycheck gets electronically deposited to our checking account. Our bills get paid by direct deposit, and we never even touch it. We never even see it. We never even think about it. So Kennedy was causing people to do something that most of them found to be uncomfortable. They thought it was silly. You know, this is silly, washing my money, ironing my money. How silly is that? But it helped to reveal to them their deeper beliefs. Their deeper beliefs about their relationship with money. Their deeper beliefs about their relationship with supply, with substance, with God as the only provider. It caused people to dig really deeply. Now, I only brought up the money. I know we're talking about relationships, but John Randolph Price tells us if you are having any issues with money in your life, the quickest way to find out what is the cause, what is the spiritual cause, and to eliminate them is to look at your relationships with other people in your life. This is in his 40-day prosperity program. He says the reason for that is that our relationships reveal so much to us about where we are on our spiritual path, that by looking at relationships and improving our relationships, improving the consciousness that is the cause of our relationships, that then we heal whatever was going on in our consciousness that was outpicturing itself as a restriction in the flow of supply into our lives. So that's what we want to look at a little bit. That's what we want to talk about. First, we have to understand why it is so important. It is so important because everything that occurs in our life is there by right of consciousness. That is a starting point. We assume that as a starting position. By observing what's going on in my life, I can tell where my consciousness is. And then by taking specific action based on the feedback I got by observing the relationships in my life, I can grow. I can grow. Let's talk about what we mean by growth quickly. Growth is eliminating every and any idea of separation. That's the way I am defining growth. In truth, we are one. In truth, we are one with God, and we are one with each other. There is one life expressing itself in many individualized ways. You know, like the children's toy, the Light Bright. There's one light in there, but it's shining up through many different pegs, and together the pegs are creating some kind of a unique and wonderful picture that any one peg by itself couldn't create. There's one life expressing itself through us. That is the truth. The experience that we have here on earth is an experience of separation. In the mythology of the Bible, it's represented by being cast out of the garden, leaving the garden. We feel that we are separated from our good. And Curtis Hopkins tells us we can start our growth by declaring that there's a good for me and I ought to have it, and naming that good. But ultimately, all of our growth along the spiritual path is a process of elimination. There's nothing to be added to us. We are never going to be more spiritual than we are right now. But we can realize more of our spiritual nature. than we are realizing right now. So all of our spiritual practice, all of our meditation, all of our reading, all of our spiritual mind treatment, all of these things, what they're doing is they are helping us to eliminate, to dissolve, to let go of the ideas of separation in our consciousness. Now it's easy for us to look and see ideas of separation out there, in the external world where the five senses are pointing. We believe that God is out there somewhere, and we are separate from other people. They are not here. They are down the hall. They are in another city. We are separated from the good we feel that we ought to have. The health, the wealth, relationships, the fulfilling activities, all of those things. But if we come back within, if we turn our attention inward, and instead of looking outward and putting all of the trouble out there, we must recognize that what we see out there is just a reflection of what is going on in our consciousness. Excuse me. And what is going on in our consciousness is that we are in fact separated from ourselves. We don't know truly who the self is, who the persona is, as Carl Jung would say. There's the I that I think that I am, and there's the I that I show you. And eventually we come to find out that the I that I think I am is the I that I'm showing me. We feel like we are divided and we are separated internally. We are separated from the very life that is us, the very life that animates us. The God that created us, that is both within and without. So this idea of looking at our relationships then to find out where we are on that path, what we're looking for is, where do we have ideas of separation? Excuse me, where do we have ideas of pushing away? Where do we have ideas of rejection? And what can I do to go within my own consciousness and to turn my mind away from the separation? See, this is important, in that sometimes we think, well, we have to go in there and we have to find that separating idea and we have to just surgically go in and remove it. And of course, while we're doing that, we're thinking about ideas of separation, and what we're thinking about grows. No, we just have to recognize that they're there, and we don't want them to be there. And then we dissolve them by turning our attention to unity. When we face away from the sun, we can see only our shadow. When we turn and we face towards the sun, we can't see the shadow. The shadow is behind us. We see the brightness of the sun. We turn away from the limiting ideas. We know that they're there. We know the shadows are there, but we don't want them, and we turn away from them. And we turn to the truth of the unity. Excuse me. So let's look at the many different kinds of relationships we have in our lives and some of the ideas that go with them, and we'll come to the ideas of our romantic relationships, right? Our deepest love. We're all children. We have a relationship with adults. We have a relationship with parents, and we are children. And then we go through a period of life where we are parents, and we have relationships with our children. We have relationships with other parents. We may still have relationships with our own parents. And then if we live long enough, what happens is the relationship changes again, and we may become like children again in terms of our own children may become caretakers for us. They may assist us later in life. And we go through those relationships. We go to school and we're students. We may go on to become teachers in some other regard. We go to work and we're employees, and at some point we may own a business and we may become employers. We have transactional relationships with many different people. You may walk into the 7-Eleven and buy a stick of gum, and hand somebody $1 through the little slot, money slot, and think nothing of it, and think nothing of them. The same way that perhaps when we swipe our credit card, we never stop to think about the whole principle of supply as it is expressing in our lives. So what we have in each of these relationships is we have an opportunity to observe ourselves in action and to ask ourselves, what would I have to believe to be true in order to behave that way, in order to think of another person that way? And is what I would have to believe to be true, is it representative of what I know to be the spiritual truth, the unity of all life, that we are all individualized expressions of God? I'll give you an example of children that Lori and I observed one time that was just really fascinating. One of my friends, when we worked in RTP, there was a large community of electrical engineers from India, and I worked with several gentlemen who were Hindu, and we became friends. And one of them invited us to his daughter's wedding. And I don't know if you've ever been to an Indian wedding or not, but it is quite an affair. It goes on for 3 days. So we only went to one of the 3 days. And we went to the Hindu temple out in Morrisville, up at the airport in Raleigh. And it was just filled with people. And in the center of the temple was kind of like this little awning tent, and the couple that were being married were sitting on pillows, and the priest was sitting there, and the priest was reading prayers in Sanskrit and burning incense and doing all kinds of really interesting things, that I had never seen before. But the whole community was there. The whole community of family and friends and neighbors, they were all there. They were all watching. They were all observing. And all of the children were there. And the food would come around, and it was just a tiny little taste of food, So typically in our culture, we have a wedding, we have a meal, we get a big meal, kind of, we sit at a table and we start, and we go all the way through, and we finish, we have a big meal. And in this culture, what you do is you got a little taste of this and a little taste of that, and people were constantly coming around with trays and giving you a little bit of everything. And the adults, wherever the adults were when they got something, whoever's child was near them, they would offer the child first. They would offer the child a taste of food. It didn't matter if it was their kid or their cousins or kids, from an entirely different family. It was like all of the children belonged. All of the children were precious. And as I started to learn more about the culture, I actually went and took some classes with a professor of philosophy, of Hindu philosophy, who taught out at Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he taught some classes there at the temple. And I started to realize, if you think of the child as a soul that has come back into this world, that has deliberately come into this world for the purpose of growth, if that's what you recognize children to be, a spiritual being, perhaps in a little body, perhaps not quite able to form his or her words, but a spiritual being nevertheless, a spiritual being just as you and I are, a spiritual being who has come into the care of this family, who has come into the care of this community, this spiritual community, for the purpose of discovering and growing its soul. See? How then do we treat children if that is what we hold to be fundamentally true about them? Excuse me. And it really impressed me because it was much different than I've witnessed in other cultures. In other cultures, a child might be cranky and be crying, and somebody would yell over to the parent, "Hey, come get your kid, there's something wrong with them over here." I didn't see that there. If a child needed attention, it didn't matter whose child it was. The child got love, the child got attention, the child got fed, the child got cleaned. And it was as if, well, for me, it was a fact. I couldn't tell whose children belonged to who. I couldn't tell who was the father and who was a child, or who was an uncle, or who was a cousin, or who was a stranger. They were all just treated with such love and such respect. So we can look at that then and say, how do we treat children, the children in our lives? Do we recognize them to be spiritual beings who have come here? And yes, sometimes they may be stubborn, and yes, sometimes they may be cranky, and yes, they may sometimes get on our nerves, but can we recognize that they are beautiful spiritual beings who have come into this world, just as you and I have, for the purpose of discovering our own soul, our own spiritual nature? And can we nourish them and cherish them and nurture them in that way? And can we recognize then that as they grow older, as they come into the workplace, as we go into the workplace, that we are still those spiritual beings. And instead of being in the workplace to compete with one another, to make more money than one another, to get ahead, to get promoted, and all those other things, can we recognize that our work is simply an expression of our own self? And our work, too, is an opportunity for us to recognize how we treat other people, how we get along with other people. Are the people that we sell our product to, or are they just people that we are using to get money? Are we gonna sell them something whether they need it or not because we want the commission? Are we going to be a shark? Are we going to be a hunter out there in the sales force? Or are we going to be a nurturer? Are we going to develop a client base of people that we truly believe can use our products and our services? And that by us coming together, that we are helping each other in some unique way, some wonderful way. From the outside, the behaviors might look the same. Salesperson makes a call, makes a sale, signs a contract, and leaves. But there's a whole different way of respect. There's a whole different way of feeling about what we're doing. Just the same as I said, Kennedy asked people to iron their money to see, how did you feel about money? How do you feel about the people in your business? How do you feel about your clients? How do you feel about your customers? How do you feel about your coworkers? If you're going for a promotion, if there's 3 people in your department all going for the same job and you don't get it, but one of the other 2 does, can you feel good for them? Can you feel happy for them? And maybe it's just not your time. Maybe it's right for them to have this job. Maybe your good is not there. Maybe your good is in another position somewhere. Maybe your good is not even in that company. Can you trust that the universe is working for you perfectly? And what we do is we go through this and we observe the relationships in our lives. We start to recognize where we have been holding on to separation. We don't like those people over there because those people are not like us. This political party doesn't like that political party. And a lot of it has to do with fear. The politics of fear, the emotions of fear. People in power manipulate us by our fear. And the Bible tells us that love is, if we know love, we don't know fear. Jablonski says love is letting go of fear. Can we identify those areas in our lives where we are afraid of other people? And can we vow to come into our consciousness to love them, to bless them, to pray for them, to recognize them as beautiful expressions of God until our fear goes away? Until we can stand in the midst of whatever's going on and know that nothing can harm us because we are perfect love. That's our opportunity for growth. So when we come in then to our romantic relationships, they probably represent to us an even greater opportunity for the feedback, an even greater opportunity for our spiritual growth, because there's something magical, there's something mystical that people recognize that occurs when we fall deeply in love. You know, people can be giddy. Lovers can be giddy. They can be silly. They can talk to one another in their own special language, and we all just smile, you know. Isn't that wonderful? They're in love. How wonderful love is, you know. Kings can abdicate their thrones and we can forgive them and say, but they did it for love, you know. Wars are started for love. Wars are ended for love. And nobody understands it. Nobody knows what it is. It is just something magical. It is just something mystical. But in our culture, as we don't understand love, we tend to think that love has something to do with the object of our love. I can love only that object. I can love only that person. I can love only that thing. I can love only that flag or that country. I love something out there. And usually what we're doing is what we're saying is, I love the way I feel when I am with that person or I am in that circumstance. And if I no longer feel that way, then we've fallen out of love. See? I need to go find somebody else who makes me feel that way. This person's broken. We need to get rid of them and get another. And the whole thing about love is we think that we're out of control. That's why we call it falling in love. It's going insane. Love has a power over us that is scary. Right? The world is afraid of losing control. And if we truly fall in love, we might lose control. So there's always this reservation. There's always this holding back. Well, maybe I shouldn't fall so much in love. Maybe I'll get hurt if it doesn't work out. You know, maybe I'm losing my mind. All of these kind of things that human beings deal with. And what we can do, what we can understand when it comes to our special relationships with our life partners, our significant others, our spouses, our special someones in our life, is we can stop and recognize that we are not entering into this relationship out of need. If you go into a relationship thinking, well, you know, I need somebody to take care of me in my old age, you'll wind up taking care of them in your old age. We are not going into this relationship out of convenience. We are going into this relationship because by entering into this relationship, I can see the presence of God within you so clearly that you are leading me closer to God. That by dissolving any and every idea in my consciousness that says we are different then, we are apart from one another, we are separate from one another, I can dissolve any and every idea of separation in consciousness, separation from my own self, separation from other people. So if we look at our special relationships, our romantic relationships, there's a path of yoga that Osho talks about, which is a path of devotion. A path of devotion that by simply devoting ourselves to another, whether it be our concept of God, whether it be a concept of a saint or an angel, or a concept of the love of our life, by devoting ourselves to doing every and anything we can within consciousness to dissolve any idea of separation by only bringing ourselves to recognize that this person is a beautiful expression of God. And if I forget that, I have an opportunity to change my consciousness, to remove that idea of separation, and to bring myself back to the realization that here is the love of God in my very presence. And as we start to do that, we can't help it, as Gibran said, love is like perfume. You can't sprinkle it on another without getting some upon yourself. So what happens is we start to recognize, hey, wait a minute. Not only is my special someone the very expression of God's love right here in my life, but I am the very expression of God's love in their life. God hugs me by means of another. God hugs you by means of me. I learned to love my own self. I learned to grow by removing ideas of separation that had existed in my own consciousness. Any ideas that separate me from my love, I dissolve. Any ideas that separate me from myself, I dissolve. Any ideas that separate me from my God, I dissolve. And then we can experience the unity. See, we can't experience unity while we're experiencing separation. It just doesn't work that way. You can't see the light while you're looking at the shadow. So what I'm suggesting as we go forward this year, as I mentioned last week, there's three major paths to God: knowledge, service, and love. And let's consider that love, as it appears, love defined as the experience of oneness, and love as it appears in our relationships, even our transactional relationships. Can I recognize that person selling me the stick of gum as the presence of God, performing a service? Am I glad that they're there? The filling station is open at night when I needed gas. Somebody was there. Can I start to experience life then not as this, I'm kind of going through it and other people are going through it and we are ships that are passing in the night, but we are all in this mystical dance together. We are all in this cosmic ballet together, like the stars in the heavens moving around and around and around, and we look through the telescope and we go, wow. Can we recognize that each and every person who comes into our life is a beautiful expression of God, there for a purpose, revealing to us what we believe to be true? And then can I use my special relationships, my most intimate relationships, the people I spend the most time with in my life? Can I allow that relationship to be my path to God? By learning how to love God as this person, in this person, through this person, by being able to look into his or her eyes and see the very love of God looking back to me, by moving through any of my petty ideas that are beliefs in separation, can I truly bring myself to loving God in them and as them, in myself and as myself, in all of mankind, in all nations, in all religions, in all sentient beings. Viktor Frankl wrote one of the most powerful books I have ever read. It took me months to read it. And I cried and I shook. I couldn't believe what I was reading. For he described the horrors of Auschwitz. His whole family had been taken away from him and gassed. And Frankl said he refused to hate. Nothing could make him stop loving. Can we be inspired by this one man's story that lets us know that no matter how difficult we think another person might be, no matter how difficult the circumstances might be, that if we look hard enough, and if we look long enough, and if we look deep enough, we will find that in there somewhere is the very love and the very presence of God. And if we communicate with that, even silently, that love will respond to us. So let's go forward this year and let's refuse to hate. Let's become the great lovers that the world is crying out for. Let us see the presence and the activity of God in every child we meet, in every person, in every store, in all of our co-workers and our bosses and our clients and our suppliers, in our family, in our friends, and in our special someone. The more we grow spiritually, the deeper in love we are. This is why Augustine, towards the end of his life, at the beginning of his life, he gave us lots and lots of rules and regulations. But at the end of his life, he said, there's only one commandment. Love and do what you will. And some ministers try to correct him and say, well, he meant to say love God and do what you will. But it doesn't need any correction. For if you know what love is, you know what God is. Love your special someones. Love yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else will fall into place. And so it is.